So thank you, Jen, once again for being here. We were talking about foreign aid, international development, but I want to know that contrary to what many international organizations believe, economic development is very messy. It's not like a black box where you add some inputs and then you get the desired outcome. For you, what are some of the drivers of economic development?
I think the most important thing is education, right? And I think if you look at how education transforms societies, you can't help but wonder, like, to me, it's the most important investment. Now, facilitating education development assistance is a very hard thing. But in many parts of the world, what I've seen is a deep, deep hunger for education. Like, you look at what people are demanding. And, to give some of my friends in the aid world credit, I think a lot of people do recognize that it's very difficult to say, what leads to development. And it is a messy process. And I think we know that it's a messy process. But I think the response is, let's try everything. And hey, let's try everything, but so long as it doesn't create perverse incentives, create real fungibility for bad governments. When you subsidize so many public services for communities, or for government systems, you're providing aid directly to communities, then because you're concerned about these real humanitarian issues, then you let the governments off the hook. Right? We call these rentier dynamics in economics. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of the aid system, is how you don't let aid yield that. And when you have very poor economies and you have very high, aid to GDP ratio, that is a very real problem. It's a very real problem. But on the other hand, do you want to withdraw aid from these very poor societies?
But do you think, I agree with you that education is one of the key drivers of economic development, but do you think that education should be, focused on empowering individuals, or how that education should look like? Because you hear a lot about, like, a lot of people talking about how you should have this educational programs, and so people are more aware of their surroundings, or they have like a more long-term vision of their lives instead of like just surviving. So that gives them more, like, that aligns the interest for them to develop economically. Right. But how do you see this?
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a very thoughtful approach to the issue of time horizons, right? So if you see yourself in the future, you're going to want to develop. But then what's being taught, of course, is very important. And, how much are you emphasizing STEM fields and engineering and the things that will actually generate economic development? But you also want to emphasize other kinds of the humanities are important, right? So the critical thinking skills that should be taught as part of the humanities and that are often very neglected in poor countries. But go ahead.
And how do you think that how education has an effect on societies that are very polarized, or that are like post-conflict societies? Do you think that makes the tensions bigger, or does people are more cooperative?
It depends how that education is implemented, right? So if you have a very divided society and you let divided communities decide, this is how we're going to educate each other, but with a common understanding that we want to resolve our conflict. You could have a post-conflict society where the war wasn't resolved in a way that everyone feels happy with, and then you have education systems that promote hatred, right, towards the other side. Looking at the Middle East right now, it's very interesting to see how some countries in the Middle East, for example, have completely altered their education systems to promote peace. And if we look at The UAE and Saudi Arabia are two examples where they were once promoting, conflict with Israel and calling for Israel's destruction and things like that. However, regardless of what you may feel about the conflict in the Middle East, when you have an education system that dehumanizes others like that, you're not going to have peace, right? You're agitating towards war. So, a lot of people are pointing towards, Hamas. Hamas has done that, quite extensively with extensive UN support inside of Gaza, unfortunately. Can education be a tool to end the war? I really do hope so. It helps people see people on the other side as human. Yeah. And once you have education systems that facilitate dehumanization, then you're back into a vicious cycle of conflict. And it's very easy to do this.
I think it's very interesting that when I had this question in mind, I thought you were gonna say like something more economic, because a lot of economists talk about land titling or property rights as key drivers of economic development, but I don't think that's always the case.
So this is so we've done a lot of research on property rights. But our work has been, and this is work that I've done with Ilya Murtazashvili, it's less on the relationship between property rights and growth. I think there's a lot of people who point to property rights as an important source of growth. I almost think that, but the point that we make is that how do you get property rights? It's an antecedent question, is that we get property rights not through a formal legal system, but through informality. So in many parts of the world, like in Afghanistan, you have informal property arrangements. And so the question we ask is less about economic development and the relationship between property rights and development, but how you actually establish a property regime to begin with the assumption that it's a major contributor to economic growth and economic development, but may not be the only one, right?
But I think you can also tie it to education, because if you're not educated, you don't know how to value your property, you don't know how to invest in it, and that hinders economic development.
Maybe. I think with property rights, people do know, how many crops they can grow and what they can do with their land, and they understand its value. I think where you get more challenges when you have property insecurity, you can't get things like collateral and loans. And that's the Hernando de Soto pointed out towards long-term development. Where we argue with de Soto a little bit is that if you just give people state property rights, economic development will come from this. And we argue that property rights and establishing a property regime is much more than just giving people a legal title. A legal title, and this is what our work is on, you need a property arrangement, which includes the ability to have a cadaster. You need to be able to define land, a plot. You need to be able to enforce, have a system for people to come to agreement about who owns what land. And then once you have those agreements, you need to be able to create a system that enforces those rules. And so what de Soto says is that's the state's role. We say, actually, no, communities can be better at that than the state often can. So that's the question we're interested in, is how you establish property regimes, with the assumption that the good econometricians have done really good analysis on property rights and economic growth. But we're really interested in assuming that property rights is really important for the development of society. How do you develop a property regime?
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, because I feel like that's a topic where a lot of scholars are debating whether the state has a role, or are the informal institutions that are the ones who have to, I don't know, work towards like securing their properties so they can develop themselves.
Right. So I think what we would argue from the work that we've done on property rights is that the state is important. But the state, should the state be, especially in weakly institutionalized environments, this isn't the case everywhere. Some places you have very strong capacity of the governments at the local level to, run a cadaster and do a land survey. In other places, you don't. And so the question is, if you don't have a cadaster, and if you haven't, marked out different land plots, can you just allow communities to do this themselves and have communities come to an agreement about what land belongs to whom? I'll give you an example of this. In Afghanistan, very early on in my work there, I befriended a gentleman who actually was responsible for implementing the first land cadaster in that country. So a land cadaster is, basically it's the mapping of the land to see whose land belongs to whom. And he was doing this in the 1970s, but unfortunately he never got to complete his work because of the Soviet invasion and the war that resulted from that. And so he was determined. I met him later in his life, and he said, I really think that this is very important for economic development. We still need this cadaster, but the state has no capacity. They're still fighting. So he came up with this idea to take satellite images of villages that he got from the US government, US Geological Survey, and brought them to different villages of Afghanistan. And when he took these maps, these huge maps, he got the community to sit around and then use that map and just plot out what land belongs to who. And in that process, we actually wrote a chapter about this. In that process, people had a lot of disagreements, like this is mine, this is yours, no that, this is where it stops, right? Or, the people who own this haven't been in the village for 30 years because there's been wars, so there's questions about who the land belongs to. But what he was able to do was get people to agree using that map. And it was amazing. They'd never seen maps of their village before. Sure. Never seen, like, what? That's our village. Wow. And then they would draw on the map as a community and make an agreement. And they'd all sign the map, or they'd use their thumbprint, because a lot of Afghans are illiterate. So they use their thumbprint and put it on the map. And that was the cadaster. That was the legal titles, right?
That's an amazing story, because that's how you see in real life how communities can come together and solve such a complex problem, such as property rights.
But here, this was a case of an Afghan. This was an external. You could even consider this like an aid project, right? Mm-hmm. Came to the community and said, "Here, let's try to solve this way." And the aid project was simply providing them maps.
Yeah. Well, I think this is very interesting, and we'll talk a little bit more about research agendas and how scholars are addressing these issues in the next part. But thank you, Jen, for this insightful information.